So let's do a video going over question 3 for this handout, more FRQ practice on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So question 3, we can do most of it, but I want you to overlook or ignore what you see here in part A and the concept of what we call the current account. And as we wrote here in the handout, don't fret, this is something we'll learn about in Unit 6. It's not something that you need to be responsible for right now, but the rest of this question is great practice for using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. So in this question, we're going to skip part A. So I'm just going to write skip next to that so we have a placeholder. And I'm going to jump right into part B. It says, assume the economy of Sweden is in long run equilibrium. And now we have to graph that. So using the labels that they have given us, and again, just to reiterate something that we've been talking about in class, some of these newer FRQs use different labels than some of the old ones that we've been using in class. And you'll notice that they're asking for Y1 and PL1. We're used to sometimes putting E's there for equilibrium, but I've noticed that they've changed that a little. So this would be scored for 2 points. You're going to get 1 point for just drawing the graph the way you should, and then another point for putting the long run aggregate supply where it should. And then for part C, it says, assume the economy of the United Kingdom decreases its imports from Sweden. On your graph from part B, show the new equilibrium output and price level and label those Y2 and PL2. So let's just break this down a bit. If these are imports that are coming from Sweden, and this graph is for the country of Sweden, that means that Sweden's aggregate demand is going to fall. Remember that aggregate demand is C plus IG plus G plus XN. So that XN piece are their exports to other countries. So if their exports decline because the imports into other countries are declining, that's going to result in a lower aggregate demand because part of aggregate demand, which is XN, is going to be dropping. So we're going to shift that to the left. We're going to do the dotted lines, and we're going to give it the label that they have asked for in the question. All right, so that's on the graph. Again, I always want to put a placeholder here. Part D, as a result of the decrease in the United Kingdom's imports from Sweden, would policymakers in Sweden be more concerned about cyclical unemployment or inflationary pressures in the short run? Explain. So remember, when you see the word explain, you needed a sentence explaining how you arrived at either cyclical unemployment or inflationary pressures. Don't let the terminology make you feel intimidated. All they're wondering is, does a student have the correct graph? So let's look at this. If aggregate demand is falling, then that means that price level fell. It also means that GDP is going to fall. Notice how they had been at full employment. Now they're operating below and they've entered a recession. So that means that cyclical unemployment is going to be a problem in the country of Sweden. And policymakers is just a fancy way of saying the people in charge of economic policy in a country in the government, okay? So is the government going to be concerned about cyclical unemployment more than they're concerned about inflation and the pressures of inflation? So in order to look at that, I also have to read the graph and I have to look at what's happened to price. And when I look at the graph, I notice that price has actually fallen. So Swedish policymakers are not going to be too concerned with inflation. So for this, I'm going to zoom in. They're going to be more concerned. So I'm going to say cyclical unemployment will concern policymakers inflationary expectations or pressures rather, because the loss in GDP has resulted in a recession and lower employment levels. Now, I could say higher cyclical unemployment, but I'm just using this to sort of change my word choice and make it so I'm not saying the same thing over and over again. I think there's a variety of ways that you could answer that question. But again, if you pay attention to the vocabulary that they're using cyclical unemployment and inflation. And those are two things that are opposite according to this graph. If cyclical unemployment is growing because GDP has fallen, then that means that price level is coming down. So they can't both be of concern. And that's why that is the answer.